You are unhappy, not because life has singled you out, but because you were never taught how to live with reality without resisting it. The Stoics believed suffering begins the moment the mind demands that life behave differently than it does. Every frustration, every bitterness, every quiet disappointment is a protest against what already exists. You chase happiness as if it is something to be earned later, somewhere else, once conditions improve. But the mind that waits for peace is the same mind that guarantees its absence. The ancient Stoics warned that most people suffer more in imagination than in reality, yet modern life has perfected this suffering into a daily routine. This is not a motivational speech. It is a confrontation. If you are willing to look honestly at how your thoughts create your emotional state, you may discover something unsettling. Your unhappiness is not imposed on you. It is practiced. Unhappiness does not arrive suddenly. Like bad weather you failed to predict. It is assembled slowly, thought by thought, reaction by reaction, until it feels permanent. The Stoics never treated suffering as random. They saw it as the end result of patterns so familiar that people stop questioning them. What you call bad luck is often repetition. What you call fate is often habit. Most people believe unhappiness is caused by external events. A failed relationship, financial pressure, disrespect, delay, loss. But the Stoic view slices deeper. Events happen to everyone. What separates the calm from the tormented is not circumstance but interpretation. Two people can stand in the same storm. One curses the sky, the other adjusts their posture and keeps walking. The rain is identical. The suffering is not. You were not born reacting the way you do. You trained yourself into it. Every time you told yourself, this shouldn't be happening, you reinforced a mental reflex. Every time you replayed an insult, every time you imagined a better version of the past or a more flattering future, you fed the part of the mind that resists the present. Over time, resistance becomes identity. You stop noticing it, because it feels like you. The Stoics warned that the mind becomes shaped by what it repeatedly attends to. If you constantly monitor what is missing, life will feel incomplete even when it is generous. If you constantly measure yourself against others, peace will always feel delayed. Unhappiness, then, is not a condition imposed from the outside. It is a practiced orientation toward reality. This is uncomfortable because it removes your favorite defense. If unhappiness were accidental, you could wait for it to leave. If it were caused solely by others, you could blame them indefinitely. But if unhappiness is constructed internally, then it can also be dismantled internally. That possibility is both freeing and terrifying. It means relief is available, but excuses are not. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people suffer not because things are difficult, but because they believe things should be easier. This belief hides beneath modern complaints. You expect clarity before action, certainty before commitment, motivation before discipline, fairness before effort. Each expectation becomes a quiet demand placed on life. Life never signs that contract. The gap between expectation and reality becomes frustration, and frustration left unattended hardens into unhappiness. Notice how often your mind says when things slow down, when things slow down, when people understand me, when I reach this goal, when I feel ready. The Stoics saw this as a dangerous postponement of inner stability. Peace delayed is peace denied. A mind that requires conditions to be perfect before it can rest will never rest because conditions are always in motion. Unhappiness also survives because it is familiar. There is a strange comfort in complaining, replaying grievances, rehearsing disappointment. These patterns create a sense of identity. You know who you are when you are dissatisfied. Letting go of unhappiness can feel like letting go of yourself. The Stoics understood this resistance. They did not argue that change was easy. They argued that it was necessary. Another overlooked truth is that unhappiness feeds on unconsciousness. The moment you begin observing your thoughts rather than obeying them, their authority weakens. Epictetus reminded his students that impressions arrive automatically, but agreement is optional. You cannot stop a thought from appearing, but you can stop kneeling to it. Most people never learn this distinction. They confuse thinking with truth, feeling with fact. This is why unhappiness feels personal, even intimate. It speaks in your own voice. It narrates your experiences convincingly. It explains why you are justified in feeling the way you do. The Stoic task is not to silence this voice, but to interrogate it. Is this thought necessary? Is it useful? Is it aligned with reality, or merely with comfort? Unhappiness persists because it is rarely questioned. People analyze their problems endlessly, but rarely examine the lens through which they see them. The Stoics reversed this habit. They focused less on changing the world and more on refining perception, not because the world is irrelevant, but because the mind is the final gatekeeper of experience. Once you see that unhappiness is not an accident, something shifts. Responsibility returns to where it belongs, not as blame, but as power. If unhappiness is built, it can be unbuilt, slowly, deliberately, with practice. The Stoics never promised instant relief. They promised something more demanding and more durable, freedom from unnecessary suffering. And that freedom begins the moment you stop treating your unhappiness as something that happened to you and start recognizing it as something you have been rehearsing. Desire begins innocently. A wish for comfort, a hope for recognition, a longing for stability, love, or relief. The Stoics did not deny desire as a human impulse. They warned, however, that desire left unexamined becomes a quiet architect of suffering, not because wanting is wrong, but because most people want things that are not theirs to command. The moment desire attaches itself to outcomes beyond your control, peace becomes conditional. You begin to bargain with reality. If this happens, then I can relax. If they change, then I can be content. If I achieve this, then I will finally feel whole. The Stoics recognized this pattern as a trap. A mind that ties its well-being to external results is a mind that has surrendered its sovereignty. Epictetus was blunt about this. He divided life into two categories: what is up to you and what is not. Your judgments, intentions, and actions belong to you. Other people's reactions, the timing of success, the behavior of the world do not. Desire ignores this boundary. It reaches outward, grasping for guarantees that life has never offered. When those guarantees fail to arrive, frustration follows. When frustration lingers, suffering takes root. Modern life amplifies this problem. You are encouraged to desire constantly. More comfort, more visibility, more approval, more certainty. Desire is framed as ambition, and ambition is praised without question. But the Stoics made a crucial distinction. Ambition aimed at virtue strengthens the soul. Ambition aimed at outcomes enslaves it. One builds character, the other builds anxiety. Notice how desire tightens the mind. You begin to monitor the world for signs that what you want is approaching or slipping away. Attention narrows. Patience erodes. Every delay feels personal. Every obstacle feels unjust. This is not because the obstacle is severe, but because desire has already decided how things should unfold. Reality becomes an interruption to your internal script. Marcus Aurelius warned himself daily against this habit. He reminded himself that wanting events to happen as he preferred was the shortest route to disturbance. The Stoic alternative was not apathy, but alignment. To want what happens, not to demand what does not. This sounds passive until it is practiced. In reality, it requires immense discipline. It means training desire to follow reason rather than impulse. Most people resist this idea because they confuse reduced desire with reduced life. They imagine a dull existence stripped of passion. The Stoics argued the opposite. Unrestrained desire dulls life by keeping the mind in constant anticipation or regret. When desire loosens its grip, attention returns to the present. Experience sharpens. Small things regain weight. Peace is no longer postponed. Another way desire creates suffering is through comparison. You do not simply want something, you want it more than others, sooner than others, or without the struggle others endured. Comparison turns desire into resentment. The Stoics saw comparison as a theft of joy. The moment you measure your progress against another person's path, you abandon your own. Desire begins to feed not on need, but on envy. Desire also disguises itself as necessity. You tell yourself you need certain conditions to be okay. You need validation. You need clarity. You need reassurance. The Stoics challenged this language. They asked whether these things were truly required for virtue or merely preferred for comfort. Most desires collapse under honest inspection. They are wants wearing the costume of needs. There is also a deeper layer to desire that the Stoics understood well. Desire is often an attempt to escape discomfort. You want success to avoid insecurity. You want control to avoid uncertainty. You want pleasure to avoid boredom or pain. In this way, desire becomes avoidance. Instead of training yourself to endure ordinary discomfort, you attempt to purchase relief through outcomes. This strategy always fails, because discomfort is not eliminated by rearranging circumstances. It is transformed by changing your relationship to it. Seneca warned that a person who is ruled by desire is never free, even in abundance. They may possess everything they once wanted and still feel poor, because desire simply moves the goalpost. Satisfaction becomes temporary, restlessness becomes permanent. The Stoics saw this as a form of poverty more severe than material lack, a poverty of sufficiency. The alternative is not to kill desire, but to educate it. To desire what depends on you, to desire integrity over applause, effort over outcome, alignment over advantage. When desire points inward, toward character and conduct, it stops producing suffering. It becomes a source of strength. You can always act with honesty. You can always choose restraint. You can always practice courage. These desires cannot be frustrated by the world. Unhappiness thrives where desire is unchecked. It whispers that fulfillment is always one condition away, one achievement away, one person away. Stoicism interrupts this whisper. It teaches that the good life is not assembled from favorable circumstances, but from a disciplined mind. When desire is brought back under reason, suffering loses one of its most reliable engines. The question is not whether you will desire. You will. The question is whether desire will rule you, or whether you will rule it. The Stoics believed this choice, practiced daily, marked the difference between a life spent chasing relief and a life anchored in quiet strength. Most people live as though happiness is a prize to be collected, a sum of acquisitions waiting just beyond reach. More money, more recognition, more freedom, more comfort. Yet the Stoics observed a paradox that modern life constantly confirms: the more you want, the less peace you feel. Desire, when focused on what is external and uncontrolled, is a relentless engine of dissatisfaction. It sets the mind chasing, comparing, and calculating, leaving contentment perpetually postponed. To want more is not inherently wrong. Growth, ambition, and curiosity are part of the human condition. But when the mind measures itself against what it lacks, every possession, every accomplishment, and every moment of success is undercut by the next craving. One promotion replaces another. One relationship fades into yearning for validation. One achievement is eclipsed by another imagined opportunity. Peace is not cumulative. It is cultivated in the alignment of thought with reality, not in the accumulation of external goods. The Stoics argued that craving is a trap, because it relies on conditions outside your control. You can never guarantee that life will provide exactly what you want, when you want it, or in the way you want it. Each unmet expectation generates frustration, anxiety, and regret. Even when desires are fulfilled, they are fleeting. The moment of satisfaction passes, leaving the mind scanning for the next target. Happiness becomes a moving horizon, forever receding, and the soul becomes restless. Consider how often your thoughts revolve around more time, more security, more approval. Every more silently tells the mind that the present is insufficient. You signal to yourself that what you have now is not enough, and until the mind perceives sufficiency, it cannot rest. Ironically, the pursuit of more was intended to improve life, but it becomes a mechanism for constant inner agitation. The problem intensifies when desires are compounded by comparison. You do not only want more, you want more than others. Social media, cultural narratives, and personal expectations feed this cycle. Comparison makes what you have feel smaller, what you achieved feel insufficient, and what you are become inadequate. The Stoics warned against this constant external benchmark. When happiness depends on what others possess or approve of, peace becomes hostage to forces entirely beyond you. Even if life delivers all that is desired, the mind trained to want more will invent new wants. This is the subtlety of human nature the Stoics studied. Desire is bottomless. The mind, when untrained, treats fulfillment not as an endpoint but as a cue for the next longing. Each attainment is interpreted not as satisfaction but as a temporary pause before the next craving. Peace is deferred indefinitely, a casualty of the perpetual more. The Stoics offered a corrective, not by rejecting desire entirely, but by redirecting it. To seek what is within your control, to cultivate virtues rather than possessions, and to align your expectations with reality, transforms desire from a source of suffering into a tool for growth. Wanting more of virtue, courage, wisdom, and integrity cannot be frustrated by external events. These desires are sustainable and stabilizing. Notice the difference. Craving wealth or recognition makes you dependent on what is fleeting. Craving wisdom or resilience strengthens the mind, regardless of circumstance. When your desires focus inward, they generate satisfaction instead of scarcity. You are no longer at the mercy of fortune. other people's behavior, or the timing of the universe. Your inner life becomes your anchor. Peace is not the reward of obtaining more. It is the result of desiring wisely. The Stoics believed that contentment is a skill, honed by observing which wants are necessary and which are manufactured. It requires honesty, reflection, and discipline. The mind must be trained to notice its own cravings, to question them, and to refuse to obey every impulse. This is not easy. It is a practice that begins with awareness and continues through consistent application. Every craving that is unexamined, every desire that is unchecked, is a thread in the web of inner turmoil. When the mind accumulates too many threads, it becomes ensnared. Peace slips away, unnoticed, until dissatisfaction feels like the default state of being. Understanding this is the first step. Recognizing that wanting more is not only inevitable, but also a source of suffering is the doorway to a different path. The Stoics did not promise a life without wants. They promised clarity and mastery over them. Wanting wisely, focusing on what can be nurtured, cultivated, and controlled, changes the stakes. The mind ceases to wander endlessly after illusions of satisfaction and begins to rest in the only place peace can truly exist, in disciplined, conscious choice. To stop suffering, you do not need less life. You need less untrained desire. The moment you release the endless more that governs your attention, you reclaim the present. You stop punishing yourself for what is missing and start recognizing what is sufficient. Paradoxically, wanting less in the wrong way opens space to experience more in the right way, more clarity, more freedom, more inner stability. From the moment we are born, we begin believing that life can be ordered according to our will. Childhood teaches us to push, pull, and manipulate our surroundings. Yet, as adults, this instinct often becomes a silent source of suffering. The Stoics observed that the craving for control is one of the mind's most consistent traps. We believe that if we can orchestrate events, secure outcomes, or influence others, then we can achieve peace. But the truth is stark. The more we chase control, the more fragile our inner stability becomes. The illusion of control is subtle. It appears in everyday routines, meticulously planning each day, overanalyzing interactions, or attempting to predict the future. On the surface, these behaviors seem practical, even responsible, but underneath, they reveal a mind that refuses to accept uncertainty. Each plan, each expectation, each imagined scenario carries with it an unspoken demand. The world must bend to my desires. When reality inevitably resists, tension arises. Disappointment becomes habitual. Stress becomes constant. Peace remains elusive. Epictetus warned that humans frequently confuse control with mastery. We treat external events as if they were subject to our will, forgetting that only our judgments, choices, and actions are truly ours. Yet, most people live as though the opposite were true. They obsess over what cannot be altered while neglecting what can. You cannot control other people's words, the economy, or the timing of fortune. Trying to do so is a form of mental overwork, a slow erosion of energy and joy. Modern life amplifies this trap. With technology, social media, and constant information, the mind is fed endless possibilities to micromanage. We monitor reactions, check metrics, anticipate responses, and strategize endlessly. This creates an illusion. We believe we are preparing, securing, or mastering life, when in reality, we are tethering ourselves to outcomes that cannot be guaranteed. Every deviation from our plan triggers anxiety, frustration, and a sense of helplessness. Consider relationships, a domain rife with control fantasies. We attempt to shape people to our liking, hoping for specific behaviors, approval, or affection. We interpret their moods as tests or threats, believing our inner peace depends on their compliance. The Stoics recognized this as a sure path to distress. No one else is responsible for your tranquility. It is yours alone. Attempting to purchase stability through the behavior of others ensures disappointment. The illusion of control also thrives in the professional sphere. Ambition is encouraged, goals are celebrated, and planning is praised. Yet, when your sense of worth or satisfaction depends on outcomes that are partially or entirely external, you are constantly walking on a tightrope over frustration. Projects fail, clients react unexpectedly, colleagues disappoint. A mind tethered to the result experiences a perpetual storm, regardless of actual achievement. Stoicism provides a powerful corrective. The philosophy teaches the separation of what is up to you and what is not. Your actions, your choices, your intentions, these are yours. Everything else, the reactions of others, the unfolding of events, the vagaries of fortune, belongs to the world. Accepting this boundary does not mean inaction. It means focus. Effort is applied where it is effective. Attention is spared where it is wasted. Peace is recovered, not by bending reality, but by bending perception. The exhaustion caused by the illusion of control is not only emotional, it is physical. Constant mental monitoring drains attention, weakens resilience, and reduces the capacity for joy. When you believe your well-being depends on factors outside yourself, every setback feels catastrophic. Minor deviations feel like crises. The mind is in perpetual vigilance, never resting. Stoic practice interrupts this cycle. By training the mind to accept the uncontrollable, tension dissolves, focus sharpens, and energy is restored to meaningful activity. Another dimension of this illusion is how we imagine certainty where none exists. We plan for contingencies, anticipate every outcome, and simulate every possible failure. While foresight has value, it becomes destructive when it creates the expectation that reality must conform to the mind's forecasts. The Stoics taught that reality is indifferent. It will proceed according to its own nature, unconcerned with our expectations. The task of the wise is to align with it, not demand compliance. This also explains why people oscillate between anxiety and disappointment. Anxiety arises before events we attempt to control. Disappointment arrives afterward, when outcomes diverge from our imagined script. Both the symptoms of the same root cause, the mind's insistence that external reality must satisfy internal demands. Awareness of this pattern is the first step toward liberation. The second is consistent practice, choosing to act where influence exists, releasing attachment where it does not. Even the Stoics admitted that relinquishing the illusion of control is uncomfortable. Humans instinctively seek certainty, structure, and predictability. The difference lies in conscious cultivation. When you repeatedly remind yourself that outcomes are not yours to command, and that effort is your domain alone, the mind gradually loosens its grip on anxiety. Freedom emerges not in changing events, but in changing perspective. In practical terms, this means engaging fully in life without clinging to how it must unfold. It means setting goals, but detaching self-worth from their completion. It means giving your best effort and accepting the result, no matter how it arrives. It means observing uncertainty without panic, and recognizing that the world's resistance is not personal. The illusion of control drains the mind because it is endless, invisible, and persuasive. It masquerades as responsibility, wisdom, or ambition, when in truth it is a subtle form of bondage. The Stoics teach that by discerning what is within your power and relinquishing attachment to what is not, you reclaim energy, tranquility, and the capacity for genuine action. Peace is no longer a distant horizon. It becomes the natural consequence of understanding where control ends and where it truly begins. Pause for a moment and ask yourself, what in your life do you keep trying to bend to your will, only to find that it slips through your fingers? Perhaps it is a relationship that refuses to behave as you wish, a career path that never unfolds according to plan, or your own mind, which betrays you with doubt, worry, or hesitation. The Stoics were relentless in asking such questions, because they understood that the key to freedom lies in recognizing the futility of attempting to command the uncontrollable. Most unhappiness is a reflection of this very struggle, a struggle you repeat daily, often without awareness. Humans are hardwired to try to impose order. From childhood, we are trained to achieve, to win approval, to predict outcomes, to anticipate consequences. While some level of foresight is necessary, the problem begins when the mind treats the world as if it were designed to obey us. A person becomes frustrated, not because life is cruel, but because life refuses to conform to imagined standards. Expectations that remain unmet generate tension, resentment, and despair. Ask yourself, how much of your attention is spent monitoring outcomes that are beyond your influence? How often do you worry about other people's thoughts, actions, or decisions, believing that your own happiness depends on them? How often do you rehash conversations, rehearse confrontations, or anticipate failures that may never occur? Each moment spent in this mental theater strengthens the illusion that control is possible, and each failure reinforces the belief that life is unfair. The Stoics, however, teach a radical alternative. Focus entirely on what lies within your power, your actions, your judgments, your effort. Everything else, the words of others, the trajectory of events, the timing of fortune, exists outside your domain. By repeatedly asking what you are trying to control and acknowledging its true nature, you begin to untangle yourself from unnecessary suffering. The very act of observation begins the process of liberation. Consider relationships, a domain where this question cuts deepest. You may hope for respect, love, validation, or loyalty from someone else, believing that these are necessary for your peace. Yet, when they fail to meet your expectations, frustration emerges. The Stoics remind us that the behavior of others is not our responsibility, nor is it a reliable source of serenity. Wanting someone to act differently is like demanding that the wind blow in a direction of your choosing. It is futile, exhausting, and ultimately irrelevant to your character. In careers, this question exposes another common trap. You may strive for promotions, recognition, or perfect outcomes, thinking these are markers of competence, self-worth, or security. Yet these achievements are never fully within your control. Circumstances, timing, and the actions of others intercede constantly. A mind that links satisfaction to these outcomes is perpetually unsettled. By asking what is beyond your influence, you learn to redirect energy toward effort, preparation, and integrity, the elements that remain firmly within your grasp. Even internally, this question matters. How often do you attempt to control emotions, thoughts, or impulses that naturally arise? You resist fear, suppress grief, and push away doubt, believing that mastery means absence of these feelings. The Stoics taught that the mind cannot command every fleeting impression, but it can choose how to respond. Observing thoughts without being driven by them is a form of control far more powerful than attempting to suppress their appearance. Directing attention to what is uncontrollable also reshapes expectations. When you accept that outcomes, other people, and events do not obey your will, you begin to notice what is actually available. Effort becomes a source of pride rather than anxiety. Decisions gain clarity because they are based on reason, not desperation. Peace grows because the mind is no longer chained to the whims of fortune. Now consider habits. How often do you try to control circumstances rather than your own behavior? Attempting to force comfort, certainty, or approval creates endless frustration. The Stoic prescription is simple yet demanding. Focus only on cultivating virtues and consistent action. Let external events unfold as they will, without resistance. The result is not passivity, but clarity. A mind freed from trying to dominate the uncontrollable is alert, responsive, and resilient. This question, what are you still trying to control that never obeyed you, is not a one-time reflection. It is a daily practice, a mental exercise that builds awareness and strengthens discipline. By revisiting it regularly, you begin to notice the areas where your energy has been wasted. You begin to redirect effort toward what matters, how you act, how you respond, how you interpret events. Each acknowledgement of futility reduces unnecessary tension, revealing the space in which true freedom exists. The Stoics emphasize that liberation is found not by changing the world to match your will, but by changing the mind that resists it. When you stop insisting that life behave according to expectation, you reclaim energy and serenity. You learn to act with intention, observe without attachment, and accept without resignation. The mind that ceases trying to control the uncontrollable is the mind that finally rests. Ask yourself this now. Which areas of your life have become battlegrounds of futility? Which outcomes, people, or circumstances do you cling to, believing that peace depends on their alignment with your desires? Recognizing them is the first step. Observing them without judgment is the next. Redirecting your energy toward what is within your power is the practice that transforms struggle into stability. Every moment spent wrestling with the unmanageable is a moment of peace lost. Every time you release what never obeyed you, serenity grows. The Stoic path is not to escape life, but to engage with it wisely, investing effort where it is effective and letting go where it is wasted. In this way, the mind is freed, the soul strengthened, and unhappiness slowly unlearned. Humans are naturally inclined to seek comfort. It feels safe. It feels familiar. From infancy, we are trained to avoid pain, hardship, and uncertainty. Food, warmth, shelter, and affection are essential. Avoiding cold, hunger, and fear is instinctive. Yet, as the Stoics warned, when the mind extends this instinct into every aspect of life, it becomes a subtle but relentless source of unhappiness. Avoiding discomfort may feel protective, but it is a slow poison for the soul. The life you live to stay comfortable may ultimately be the life that keeps you weak, untested, and unfulfilled. Discomfort is unavoidable. It comes in many forms: physical challenges, emotional strain, social friction, failure, uncertainty, and moral dilemmas. The moment we attempt to sidestep these experiences, we reinforce fragility. Every time we choose ease over effort, we miss an opportunity to train the mind and body. Stoics believed that virtue is forged in the furnace of adversity, not the shelter of convenience. Avoidance may bring temporary relief, but it always comes at the cost of growth, resilience, and inner strength. Modern life magnifies the temptation to avoid discomfort. We surround ourselves with conveniences that shield us from the natural flow of challenge: climate control, instant communication, entertainment, and social media that numbs boredom or anxiety. Every tool that removes friction is useful, yet it also becomes a crutch when used exclusively. When the soul is never tested, it stagnates. Resilience weakens, courage atrophies, and the capacity for deep satisfaction diminishes. Consider the fear of criticism. Many people avoid expressing their opinions, taking risks, or asserting themselves because of the discomfort of possible rejection or disapproval. Yet, avoiding these small trials gradually conditions the mind to surrender in larger arenas. The Stoics recognized that confronting minor discomforts trains the inner self for the unavoidable challenges of life. Courage, patience, and wisdom are not discovered in comfort. They are exercised through resistance, struggle, and endurance. Emotional discomfort is equally instructive. Feelings of frustration, grief, or longing are not enemies to be eliminated. They are signals, teachers, and mirrors of our attachments. When we flee from these emotions, attempting to distract or suppress them, we miss the lessons embedded in experience. Stoic practice encourages observing emotion without judgment, enduring it without panic, and responding with reason. Avoidance, in contrast, teaches the mind that suffering is intolerable, making future discomfort even more threatening. Physical discomfort, too, shapes the soul. Fasting, exercise, exposure to cold, and deliberate restraint were all recommended by Stoics not as ascetic punishment, but as training. These acts expand tolerance, sharpen discipline, and cultivate self-mastery. The modern obsession with comfort, soft beds, abundant calories, constant entertainment, reduces the body's capacity to endure, and by extension, the mind's capacity to confront adversity. Comfort, when pursued without balance, creates dependence, vulnerability, and anxiety when life inevitably resists. There is a subtle irony in avoiding discomfort. It often creates the very suffering we fear. People obsess over avoiding minor pain while ignoring larger, unavoidable challenges. A career avoided because of fear of failure may create decades of regret. A conversation avoided out of anxiety may fracture a relationship. Avoiding small social discomfort may eventually isolate the soul. The Stoics understood that voluntarily engaging with manageable challenges inoculates the mind against the inevitable struggles that life delivers uninvited. Fear of discomfort also distorts decision-making. People weigh risks excessively, seeking to protect themselves from temporary strain, yet they underestimate the long-term cost of avoidance. A mind trained only in ease cannot navigate difficulty with skill or calm. The Stoics observed that wisdom is honed precisely in adversity. Avoidance deprives the soul of practice. The more we evade, the less equipped we become when confrontation is unavoidable, and suffering grows exponentially. Another danger is that avoiding discomfort fosters entitlement. When life deviates from convenience, it feels unjust. Minor frustrations are magnified. Stoic training teaches that the world is indifferent, that obstacles are neither enemies nor personal slights. When we habitually avoid friction, every obstacle becomes a crisis. Pain becomes intolerable, patience erodes, and resilience fails. The mind becomes fragile, not because life has grown harsher, but because it has been shielded from manageable challenges. Avoiding discomfort also undermines the development of character. Virtue, courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom requires engagement with tension. Each deliberate act of endurance, each choice to act rightly despite inconvenience, strengthens the soul. Conversely, habitual avoidance erodes moral courage. Decisions are guided by fear of friction rather than by principle. The Stoic maxim, "What is within your power is your own action," becomes hollow if the mind consistently chooses the path of least resistance. Even relationships reveal this principle. Difficult conversations, honest feedback, and boundaries often produce temporary discomfort, yet avoiding them leads to long-term suffering, resentment, miscommunication, and disconnection. By embracing discomfort as a tool for growth, the Stoics cultivated relationships that were not shallow or fragile but resilient and authentic. Discomfort, rightly approached, builds strength that comfort alone cannot provide. The Stoics emphasized voluntary exposure to hardship precisely because it prepares the mind for the unpredictable. Life cannot be smoothed into perfection. Storms arrive, plans fail, bodies falter, and people disappoint. Those who have voluntarily faced small discomforts develop confidence, equanimity, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. Avoidance, in contrast, ensures that even minor difficulties feel insurmountable, producing unnecessary suffering. The challenge, then, is to reconsider comfort, not as the ultimate goal but as a temporary state that can coexist with deliberate engagement with difficulty. To weaken the soul through avoidance is to surrender the opportunity for growth, strength, and authentic peace. Discomfort is not punishment. It is practice. The more we willingly engage with it, the more our inner life matures. The mind, like the body, thrives on training. Finally, the Stoics remind us that the aim is not constant struggle, but conscious engagement. The goal is not to seek suffering for its own sake, but to embrace the lessons embedded in challenge. By choosing to face discomfort instead of fleeing it, the soul learns resilience, the mind develops clarity, and the heart acquires courage. Peace is not found in a life of uninterrupted ease. It is found in a life that meets reality with strength, reason, and intentionality. Avoidance may feel safe, but it is a slow drain on the soul. Engagement, though demanding, builds an enduring inner life capable of withstanding fortune's whims. To embrace discomfort voluntarily is to reclaim power, wisdom, and the freedom to live fully without being controlled by fear. From early childhood, we are taught to expect fairness. Rules in school, promises from adults, and moral lessons suggest that the world should operate according to just principles. Yet life rarely adheres to this expectation. The Stoics observed that expecting fairness is one of the most reliable sources of resentment, frustration, and unhappiness. By demanding that reality conform to our sense of justice, we set ourselves up for continual disappointment. Every perceived slight, every unmet expectation, becomes a wound not inflicted by others, but by our attachment to an ideal that the universe does not owe us. Fairness is an appealing concept, because it promises predictability. We imagine that effort should be rewarded, virtue recognized, and loyalty reciprocated. When life deviates from this imagined order, our minds react with indignation. The Stoics warned that this reaction is unnecessary suffering. Life is indifferent. The universe does not favor, punish, or reward according to human notions of right and wrong. It simply unfolds. Expecting otherwise is like trying to teach the wind manners. Consider relationships as an example. We invest time, energy, and care, hoping for reciprocity. When the response is less than what we expect, resentment grows. Friendship becomes a ledger. Love becomes a transaction. Effort becomes exploitation. The mind interprets unmet expectations as injustice, even when no ill will exists. This is a direct consequence of conflating fairness with entitlement. Stoicism teaches that moral effort is valuable in itself, not because it guarantees a particular outcome. Expecting fairness also creates comparison. We measure ourselves against others, assessing whether rewards, recognition, or success are proportionate. Social media and cultural narratives exacerbate this tendency, highlighting discrepancies and amplifying dissatisfaction. The more we fixate on equity, the less satisfied we feel with our own position. We develop bitterness, envy, and a persistent sense of grievance, all stemming from expectations that reality cannot reliably meet. Even in professional life, expecting fairness can be corrosive. You may work diligently, innovate, or support colleagues, believing that such contributions will be recognized or rewarded appropriately. When recognition is delayed, overlooked, or goes to others, resentment takes root. The Stoics urged detachment from outcome. Your responsibility is to act with virtue and diligence. The universe's response is outside your domain. Linking peace to the world's compliance is a formula for frustration. Another aspect is moral self-righteousness. Expecting fairness often makes us feel justified in resentment. I did what was right, therefore I deserve a certain outcome. The Stoics warned that this reasoning is self-deceptive. Virtue is not transactional. Justice is an internal standard, not a measure of the world's behavior. When we insist on external fairness as a prerequisite for happiness, we give the world the power to disturb us. Expectations of fairness also interfere with adaptability. Life is unpredictable. People act with imperfect knowledge, conflicting interests and biases. The mind conditioned to demand equity reacts poorly to deviation, even minor. Emotional energy is wasted on irritation and complaint, rather than applied to constructive response. Resentment clouds judgment, hampers creativity, and diminishes resilience. Stoic practice encourages preparation for imperfection, understanding that outcomes are uncertain, people are flawed, and events are rarely ideal. This principle extends to self-expectations. Many people hold themselves to standards of fairness internally. I deserve success, comfort, recognition, or happiness because I have worked hard or acted rightly. When reality fails to match these internal expectations, resentment turns inward, self-blame, frustration, and disillusionment flourish. The Stoics counseled that personal effort should be the measure of action, not the guarantee of reward. Focus on exertion, not entitlement. Expecting fairness fosters blame. Whenever outcomes deviate from expectation, we assign fault to people, circumstances, or fortune. This externalization perpetuates a victim mindset. We imagine ourselves wronged, rather than examining our own responses. The Stoics argued that true freedom arises when we relinquish blame for outcomes and focus on what is in our power, our perception, judgment, and conduct. The paradox is that fairness, when sincerely practiced internally, reduces resentment. When you cultivate justice in your own actions without demanding it from others, peace grows. You learn to act rightly, regardless of recognition or reward. This self-contained morality shields the mind from disappointment. Virtue becomes its own compensation. External inequity loses its ability to disturb you. Consider daily life, traffic, long lines, delayed responses, miscommunications, all scenarios where fairness is presumed but absent. Each small breach of expectation triggers irritation because the mind has been trained to demand compliance. The Stoics taught that anticipating imperfection and accepting the limits of human agency neutralizes resentment. By recalibrating expectations to align with reality rather than idealized notions of justice, tranquility is restored. Resentment itself is corrosive. It poisons relationships, distorts perception, and saps energy. Expecting fairness provides endless fuel for this poison. It creates a cycle. Desire for just treatment leads to frustration, which leads to anger, which leads to further expectation of correction. Breaking this cycle requires conscious effort, awareness, and the philosophical perspective that fairness is rarely delivered externally, it is cultivated internally. Finally, asking yourself how much of your suffering stems from unmet expectations can be transformative. Which outcomes, people, or circumstances do you insist must obey a sense of fairness? Recognizing these areas is the first step. Observing them without judgment is the next. Then, deliberately redirecting focus toward your own virtue, effort, and response frees energy previously wasted on resentment. The Stoics teach that peace is not the reward for fair treatment. It is the result of mastery over expectation. When you stop demanding that life behave according to your moral compass, you release resentment. You reclaim energy, clarity, and tranquility. Happiness is not a function of fairness. It is a function of how wisely you navigate a world that is often indifferent to justice. From the moment we begin interacting with the world, we are conditioned to care about what others think. Praise brings pleasure, criticism brings pain. Approval feels like safety, disapproval feels like threat. The Stoics, however, recognize that entrusting your inner peace to external opinions is one of the fastest ways to lose it. When you allow the judgments of others to dictate your mood, choices, and sense of self, you surrender a portion of your sovereignty without realizing it. Consider how subtly this occurs. You adjust your behavior to avoid disapproval. You mute your ideas to prevent critique. You embellish achievements to gain admiration. Each of these acts reinforces a hidden assumption that your value and happiness depend on someone else's perception. The more you bend to opinions, the more power others hold over your inner state. A single comment, a fleeting thought from another, can shift your mood for hours or even days. This is a form of mental taxation the Stoics warned against. Modern life amplifies this dependency. Social media metrics, likes, followers, and comments create constant feedback loops. Every post becomes a measure of validation. Every ignored message or negative remark feels magnified. The mind begins to calculate worth according to external metrics. The Stoics understood this pattern centuries before algorithms existed. When happiness depends on something outside your control, suffering becomes inevitable. What makes the problem more insidious is that opinions are fleeting, inconsistent, and often uninformed. People speak from their own biases, fears, and incomplete knowledge. Allowing such unstable signals to dictate your behavior is like trusting the wind to guide your path. You may bend, twist, and contort yourself to fit perceptions that are temporary, irrelevant, or inaccurate. Each effort is wasted energy. Each reaction is a surrender of autonomy. Ask yourself, how often do you modify your decisions to avoid judgment? How often do you censor your ideas, suppress your personality, or delay action because of what someone else might think? The Stoics would call this a transfer of power. By overvaluing external approval, you gift others the ability to shape your inner world. Freedom requires reclaiming that power. Even in intimate relationships, opinions can dominate. A partner's dissatisfaction, a friend's criticism, or a parent's disapproval can be internalized as truth, dictating choices and emotions. Stoicism teaches that other people's judgments are only meaningful when they align with reason and virtue. Otherwise, they are mere impressions, external events that do not and should not determine your self-worth. This principle also applies in professional life. You may worry excessively about colleagues' evaluations, supervisors' feedback, or public perception of your work. Such concern may motivate, but it can also paralyze. The Stoics distinguished between the effort you can control and the reception of that effort, which you cannot. Productivity, skill, and integrity are yours to cultivate. Opinions are external noise. Investing emotional energy in them is wasted labor. Another danger is moral distortion. Chasing approval can compromise integrity. People alter principles, suppress truth, and act against conscience to gain admiration or avoid critique. Over time, this erodes the self. The Stoics emphasized acting rightly for its own sake, not for praise. When virtue is conditional on opinion, it ceases to be virtue at all. Happiness tied to approval is hollow and temporary. Even casual interactions are laced with this trap. Compliments may inflate ego, criticisms may wound unnecessarily, both can become addictive. Pleasure from praise, pain from critique, creating a mental dependence on feedback loops. The Stoics teach detachment. The mind should observe opinion without automatic agreement or resistance. A thought appears, you note it, you choose how to respond. This is power regained. Directly engaging with this concept can be transformative. Ask yourself, whose opinions control my choices, emotions, or confidence? Are there areas where I defer to perception rather than principle? Reflecting on these questions reveals invisible chains. Recognizing them is the first step. Observing them without judgment is the next. Then comes deliberate action, reclaiming authority over your own thoughts, decisions, and peace. When you stop surrendering power to opinions, freedom expands. You become capable of authentic action, grounded in reason and virtue. Your mood is no longer hostage to external whispers. You gain the ability to act decisively, speak truthfully, and live consistently with your principles, regardless of applause or criticism. Stoicism frames this as a fundamental practice to live in accordance with nature and reason, not with the fluctuating moods of others. Happiness cannot exist where authority over the self is ceded. By entrusting your inner state to others, you live in constant reaction, your mind always tilting toward approval or defense. Recognizing this, and reclaiming the power that has been handed over, is not only liberating, it is a prerequisite for durable contentment. Finally, consider this as a daily exercise. Before reacting to praise or criticism, pause. Ask whether this judgment is relevant to reason and virtue, or whether it is merely someone else's impression. Respond if necessary, but do not surrender your inner peace. Over time, this practice diminishes the sway of external opinion and strengthens the sovereignty of the mind. Freedom is not found in universal approval, but in the disciplined mastery of attention, judgment, and action. Human beings are social creatures. From early life, we are conditioned to seek approval, recognition, and affirmation from others. Smiles, praise, awards, or even social media likes become tangible signals of worth. While some feedback is natural and necessary, Stoicism warns that allowing external validation to dictate your sense of self is a perilous path. When inner stability relies on others' judgments, happiness becomes fragile, fleeting, and dependent on circumstances beyond your control. Consider how subtly this happens. You accomplish a task, only to look for acknowledgement. You make a decision, then seek reassurance. You dress, speak, and behave in ways intended to attract admiration. Each of these acts, while often unconscious, transfers the responsibility for your sense of adequacy to someone else. Your confidence is no longer self-generated. It is borrowed, and borrowed confidence is unstable, liable to vanish with the slightest critique or indifference. The danger is amplified in modern culture. Social media platforms turn validation into a measurable currency. Likes, comments, shares, and followers quantify worth. Every post, Every update, every action becomes a negotiation for attention. Minds trained this way become obsessed with pleasing others, calculating responses, and adjusting behavior to optimize approval. The result is a fragile equilibrium. Contentment hinges on an ever-shifting landscape of perception, not on internal judgment. When external validation replaces inner stability, life becomes reactive. Achievements no longer bring intrinsic satisfaction. They are only meaningful if recognized by others. Compliments feel like rewards. Criticism feels like punishment. Your emotional state rises and falls according to signals you cannot control. Stoic philosophy teaches that this is a form of enslavement. True stability arises when approval and disapproval are acknowledged, but not allowed to govern the mind. Even relationships can reinforce this pattern. You may invest love, attention, or care to receive reciprocation, approval, or affirmation. When these expectations are unmet, disappointment and resentment arise. The Stoics remind us that no one can guarantee the emotional response of another. Relying on such responses for inner peace ensures perpetual dissatisfaction. Real emotional autonomy is cultivated by focusing on your own virtues and intentions, independent of reaction. The professional world is rife with similar dynamics. Promotions, recognition, awards and praise often dominate motivation. While striving for excellence is reasonable, when effort is tethered to acknowledgement, performance anxiety and self-doubt flourish. Stoics advise anchoring satisfaction in the act itself. The diligence, discipline, and integrity you exercise are what matter. External accolades are optional, but inner approval is mandatory. The problem deepens when inner self-assessment is weak. When you lack a stable sense of personal worth, others' opinions naturally fill the void. Each piece of praise becomes a lifeline, each criticism a threat. Over time, your mind becomes a pendulum, swinging between approval and disapproval, never finding rest. The Stoics recommended rigorous self-examination and the cultivation of virtue as the foundation for internal stability. Confidence rooted in personal principles is resilient to outside influence. Consider the emotional consequences. Anxiety, insecurity, and fear of rejection all increase when stability depends on others. Every interaction carries hidden stakes. Every decision is filtered through the lens of anticipated judgment. You begin to lose authenticity, curtailing expression to match expected approval. The result is not only diminished happiness, but also a life lived in partial constraint, a shadow of your potential freedom. The antidote, Stoicism teaches, is deliberate cultivation of inner validation. Develop standards of judgment, integrity, and virtue that are independent of external feedback. Observe praise and criticism as mere impressions, not determinants of self-worth. Ask yourself, does this comment reflect truth about my effort or character, or is it the fleeting opinion of another? By anchoring confidence in personal principles rather than the approval of others, the mind becomes stable, resilient, and serene. This approach also changes how achievements are experienced. Success is no longer a measure of external approval, but a reflection of consistent effort, discipline, and alignment with values. Each accomplishment provides intrinsic satisfaction, no longer contingent upon applause or recognition. The mind, free from dependence on external validation, becomes capable of genuine joy. Finally, consider this as a reflective exercise. Identify areas of life where you seek approval excessively. Ask yourself how your happiness is affected by external signals. Observe your thoughts and emotions without judgment, and begin shifting attention inward. Strengthening internal validation is a daily practice. Small, consistent acts of choosing principle over praise, effort over recognition, reason over reaction. When inner stability is cultivated, external validation becomes optional. Compliments are pleasant, criticism informative, but neither can shake the foundation of your mind. Peace emerges not from applause, but from self-reliance, wisdom, and disciplined virtue. This is the Stoic pathway to freedom. No longer a slave to the fleeting judgments of others, your mind rests in enduring tranquility. Human beings have a curious relationship with time. We spend it relentlessly, often without awareness, and yet react as though it is infinite. The future is assumed, plans are deferred, and important conversations, actions, or reflections are postponed. The Stoics observed that this illusion, that time is abundant, lies at the heart of much human unhappiness. Living as if there will always be time encourages procrastination, avoidance, and shallow engagement with life, leaving the mind restless and the soul unsatisfied. Consider how this manifests in daily life. Tasks that matter most, expressing gratitude, reconciling relationships, pursuing meaningful work, or cultivating wisdom, are often delayed. We tell ourselves, "I'll do it later, there's always tomorrow," or "time is on my side." Meanwhile, trivialities dominate, endless scrolling, minor obligations, or distractions that require minimal effort, but provide little value. The Stoics cautioned that time is not guaranteed, and every day squandered is an opportunity lost. This assumption of infinite time also creates a false sense of security. People imagine they have years to fix mistakes, to achieve goals, or to resolve conflict. When the inevitable brevity of life interrupts these plans, regret and frustration emerge. Stoicism teaches the importance of memento mori, remembering mortality, not to instill fear, but to instill urgency and clarity. Recognizing that life is finite forces us to prioritize what truly matters, rather than defer happiness to a distant, uncertain future. Even in personal relationships, the illusion of time can be destructive. Apologies delayed, expressions of love postponed, and important conversations avoided create distance that may never be repaired. We assume people will always be there, yet life is unpredictable. Illness, accidents, or estrangement can remove opportunities without warning. Stoic practice encourages conscious presence, deliberate engagement, and intentional action, living as though each moment may be the last chance to act with integrity, compassion, or courage. In professional and personal goals, the same pattern appears. People delay learning, practicing, or creating, thinking mastery or achievement is guaranteed, given enough time. But time cannot be stored, reclaimed, or guaranteed. Each day lost to distraction or avoidance narrows the window for growth. The Stoics argued that recognizing the finite nature of life brings focus, effort, and presence. By treating time as precious, each action gains significance. This mindset also explains why many feel persistent dissatisfaction. Happiness is deferred to a hypothetical future. I'll be content once I achieve X, acquire Y, or reach Z. Meanwhile, the present, the only reality we actually inhabit, is overlooked. Stoicism teaches that true peace arises when the present moment is acknowledged and lived fully, rather than treated as a mere step towards some future milestone. Living as if time is endless undermines presence and ensures that fulfillment is always just out of reach. Another subtle trap is underestimating the emotional and spiritual consequences of wasted time. Hours spent avoiding discomfort, chasing trivial pleasures, or seeking validation leave a residue of unease. The mind senses the lost potential, even when attention is absorbed elsewhere. Stoics encourage reflection. Consider how you spend each day, and whether your actions serve virtue, wisdom, or meaningful engagement. Without such reflection, time slips by unnoticed, and unhappiness accumulates silently. Even planning can become distorted when time is assumed infinite. People schedule endlessly for the future, stacking ambitions upon ambitions, yet neglecting to act decisively in the present. The Stoics emphasized intentional immediacy, aligning action with values now, rather than postponing impact indefinitely. Every moment is an opportunity for moral, intellectual, and practical exercise. Treating time as inexhaustible is a form of passive surrender, whereas treating it as finite inspires active, purposeful living. Ask yourself directly, what have you been postponing? Believing there is plenty of time. Which conversations, projects, or personal goals have been delayed under this illusion? Reflection is the first step toward recalibration. Observing the areas where you defer engagement exposes patterns of procrastination, avoidance, or misplaced confidence in future abundance. Awareness allows conscious choice to act now, rather than later. Ultimately, living as if time will always be there is a recipe for regret. It diminishes urgency, focus, and presence. It weakens relationships, blunts growth, and steals satisfaction from the present. The Stoics advocate reversing this illusion. Treat every moment as precious, every opportunity as fleeting, and every action as consequential. Time, once lost, cannot be reclaimed. Awareness of its scarcity transforms ordinary tasks into deliberate practice, trivial interactions into meaningful connections, and deferred intentions into immediate action. By embracing the finite nature of life, we align thought, action, and virtue. We cultivate mindfulness, prioritization, and courage. Happiness is no longer deferred. It is exercised in each decision, each effort, and each reflection. Recognizing the limits of time is not fatalism. It is liberation. It restores responsibility, presence, and intentionality to the mind. The Stoics teach that understanding time's fragility is a gateway to living fully, acting wisely, and achieving the inner peace that avoidance and procrastination perpetually postpone. From a young age, many are conditioned to believe that happiness is something earned. Achieve a goal, acquire possessions, gain approval, or complete milestones, and then finally, happiness will arrive. The world tells us that success, recognition, and comfort are prerequisites for satisfaction, yet the Stoics understood that this framework is a trap. Happiness is not a reward for accomplishments or good fortune. It is a byproduct of how we navigate life. When we tie joy to external conditions, we create a fragile, fleeting foundation for well-being, leaving ourselves perpetually vulnerable to disappointment. Expecting happiness as a reward conditions the mind to postpone contentment. The child is told, if you do well in school, you will be proud of yourself. The adult thinks, once I earn this promotion, I will be happy. Yet both are deferring peace to a future that is uncertain. Life does not guarantee rewards, and the Stoics argued that to wait for them is to surrender the present. Happiness tethered to outcome is temporary because the world is unpredictable, and fortune rarely aligns with expectation. One of the most insidious aspects of this reward-based approach is how it fosters entitlement. If happiness is owed for effort, then unmet expectations become sources of resentment and anger. Failure to achieve a goal, recognition denied, or justice unserved can feel like theft, generating frustration rather than reflection. The Stoics warned that such thinking anchors well-being to external forces that are inherently unstable and outside our control. True contentment must reside within the mind, cultivated through reason and virtue rather than sought through contingent circumstances. Even relationships illustrate this principle. People may invest love, attention, or kindness, expecting happiness in return. When the response does not match expectation, when appreciation is absent, affection is withheld, or reciprocation is imperfect, disappointment follows. The Stoics observed that relying on others for emotional fulfillment is a source of unnecessary suffering. Happiness is not granted by others, it emerges from disciplined judgment, moral action, and acceptance of reality as it unfolds. The pursuit of reward-based happiness also fosters comparison. Success, wealth, popularity, or recognition become benchmarks for joy. We observe peers, measure their achievements against our own, and conclude we are lacking. Even when objectives are attained, contentment is fleeting, because the mind instantly recalibrates toward new external standards. Happiness becomes a moving target, an illusion dependent on conditions that are always shifting. Moreover, reward-based happiness undermines personal agency. By placing the source of joy in outcomes, possessions, or approval, we relinquish control of our inner state. Stoicism emphasizes that the only true domain under our governance is our own mind, our perception, judgment, and action. When happiness is sought in the external world, we allow fortune, circumstance, and the opinions of others to dictate emotional stability. We are no longer actors in our lives, but spectators waiting for reward. Even challenges and failures are instructive here. The Stoics argued that the wise cultivate resilience and equanimity, regardless of circumstance. Life inevitably includes pain, loss, and disappointment. If happiness depends on reward, every setback becomes a crisis. Yet if happiness is a byproduct of virtue, reason, and disciplined choice, difficulties no longer destroy inner peace, they refine it. Trials become opportunities to exercise judgment, patience, courage, and compassion. Ask yourself directly, how often do you postpone contentment until certain conditions are met? How often do you look outward for happiness rather than inward? Recognizing this tendency is the first step toward liberation. Observation without judgment reveals the patterns of delayed joy. Deliberate practice, choosing virtuous action, cultivating gratitude, and exercising reason in the present, begins to untangle happiness from the illusion of reward. Even in daily life, small moments reflect this principle. Simple acts of mindfulness, deliberate effort in work or study, disciplined reflection, or ethical decisions create satisfaction regardless of external acknowledgement. When we anchor happiness in these controllable aspects of life, joy becomes stable and self-sustaining. It is no longer contingent on outcome, but emerges organically from living in accordance with reason and virtue. Finally, the Stoics remind us that the ultimate source of happiness lies in mastery of the mind. When you stop waiting for external reward, when you act rightly regardless of recognition, and when you cultivate virtue as an end in itself, contentment follows naturally. Happiness is never something to be earned. It is the natural state of a disciplined, rational, and virtuous mind. By relinquishing the expectation that joy is a prize, you release yourself from the cycle of longing, frustration, and resentment, stepping into a peace that is independent, resilient, and enduring. Many people confuse acceptance with resignation. They believe that to accept circumstances, limitations, or setbacks is to give up, to yield, or to abandon effort. The Stoics saw acceptance differently. It is not weakness, but the foundation of strength. True power arises when the mind recognizes what is within its control and what is not, and then acts accordingly. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It means clarity, focus, and the ability to respond effectively, rather than react impulsively or waste energy, resisting what cannot be changed. Resistance to reality is a common source of suffering. We rail against disappointment, lament misfortune, and demand that life conform to our desires. Every act of futile resistance generates tension, frustration, and anxiety. The Stoics emphasized that much of human misery comes from insisting that the uncontrollable bend to our will. Acceptance, by contrast, frees mental energy, allowing action to be directed where it is effective. It transforms struggle into purposeful engagement, not helpless complaint. Acceptance requires discernment. It is not surrender to immorality, injustice, or negligence. Rather, it is an honest acknowledgement of facts, limitations, and consequences. The Stoic principle of distinguishing between what is in our power and what is not lies at the heart of this practice. We can control our actions, judgments, and responses, but we cannot fully control the behavior of others, the whims of fortune, or the unfolding of events. Recognizing this difference is a radical act of mental strength. Consider the mind's relationship with failure. Most people resist failure, experiencing it as a blow to identity or self-worth. Acceptance reframes failure as information, a necessary teacher, and an inevitable part of growth. By acknowledging reality without embellishment or denial, the mind becomes resilient. Effort is preserved, lessons are learned, and unnecessary suffering is avoided. Resistance, in contrast, magnifies disappointment, creating layers of frustration that impede recovery and reflection. Acceptance also shapes emotional experience. Pain, loss, or uncertainty cannot always be removed, yet they can be observed without escalating into despair. Stoic practice trains the mind to note events as they are, not as it wishes them to be. This clarity allows for calm reasoning and measured response. Acceptance strengthens patience, reduces anxiety, and stabilizes the emotional landscape, while refusal to accept intensifies agitation, confusion, and internal conflict. Even in relationships, acceptance manifests as a strength rather than weakness. People cannot be forced to feel or act as we desire. Accepting their autonomy, acknowledging their choices and limitations, frees us from frustration and resentment. We may influence, persuade, or guide, but we do not control outcomes. Acceptance allows the cultivation of empathy, understanding, and effective communication, rather than manipulation or futile attempts at domination. Physical and practical realities also illustrate this principle. Health, finances, environment, and external conditions often defy complete control. Acceptance does not mean passivity. It means addressing challenges with realism, adapting strategy, and conserving energy. The Stoics distinguished between surrender and strategic compliance. Accepting what cannot be changed enables thoughtful action, turning obstacles into opportunities for skillful engagement rather than sources of wasted struggle. The paradox of acceptance is its liberating power. By acknowledging reality, the mind gains focus, autonomy, and resilience. Effort is no longer scattered in futile resistance. Emotional equilibrium strengthens. Decisions are clearer. The soul cultivates courage, patience, and wisdom. What appears as surrender to the untrained eye is actually a display of mastery over the self. Strength arises not from attempting to bend the world, but from bending one's attention, effort, and judgment toward what is within one's power. Ask yourself, where in your life are you resisting what cannot be changed? Which circumstances, outcomes, or people generate unnecessary tension because you refuse to accept their reality? Observing this resistance is the first step. Acceptance does not mean abandoning effort. It means redirecting it toward meaningful, controllable actions rather than wasted opposition. Acceptance also preserves energy for virtue. Stoics emphasized that life is finite and mental effort is precious. Resisting unchangeable events depletes this resource, leaving less for ethical action, intellectual growth, and purposeful living. Strength, then, is in discerning where effort matters and where it does not, practicing restraint and focusing energy on what can truly be shaped, one's own mind and conduct. Ultimately, acceptance is neither weakness nor resignation. It is clarity, wisdom, and courage applied to the realities of existence. By embracing what cannot be changed, you free yourself from unnecessary suffering, cultivate emotional stability, and redirect effort toward virtue and purposeful action. Strength emerges in the calm acknowledgement of fact, in the deliberate choice to act where it is effective, and in the serenity that comes from mastering response rather than controlling fate. Acceptance, when practiced consistently, transforms life. It allows the mind to face adversity with composure, the heart to experience peace in uncertainty, and the soul to navigate change without surrendering integrity. This is the Stoic path, to recognize limits, embrace reality, and act decisively within the sphere of influence, cultivating strength, resilience, and enduring tranquility. Modern life glorifies busyness. Calendars overflow with meetings, to-do lists grow interminably, and every day seems packed with obligations. Yet, beneath the veneer of productivity, busyness often conceals something far more troubling, a lack of true direction. The Stoics warned that, being constantly occupied, does not equate to meaningful action. Activity without purpose may distract from reflection, wisdom, and deliberate choice, leaving the mind exhausted but unfulfilled. Consider the subtle ways busyness masks emptiness. You may fill hours with tasks that feel urgent but are not important. Emails, social media, errands, or minor obligations. Each completed task gives a fleeting sense of accomplishment. Yet at day's end, there is often a lingering void. The Stoics observed that superficial busyness satisfies the desire to feel useful while avoiding deeper questions. Am I living according to virtue? Are my actions aligned with my values? Do my efforts contribute to what truly matters? Busyness also functions as a shield against self-reflection. Being constantly occupied prevents confrontation with uncomfortable questions about purpose, priorities, and mortality. The Stoics emphasized the importance of regular introspection, examining one's actions, motives, and life trajectory. Without pauses for contemplation, life drifts on autopilot, governed by habit, expectation, or external demands rather than conscious choice. The appearance of productivity becomes a substitute for meaning, and the mind suffers silently beneath the surface. Even noble obligations can become traps when unexamined. Work, caregiving, or social responsibilities can dominate attention, leaving little room for personal growth or ethical reflection. The Stoics warned against equating mere action with virtue. Without intentionality, effort may serve convenience, habit, or ego, rather than reason or principle. Busyness can create a sense of moral or intellectual self-importance, masking the fact that time and energy are being spent without strategic purpose. Ask yourself, how often are you busy simply to avoid stillness or reflection? How often do tasks consume you while your mind wonders if you are living authentically? Stoicism teaches that purposeful engagement requires discernment. Not all activity is meaningful. Energy invested without conscious direction contributes little to character, wisdom, or peace. By scrutinizing the quality of busyness, we reclaim autonomy over attention, effort, and growth. Busyness also impacts relationships. Endless engagement with tasks or distractions can prevent genuine connection. Time spent being productive may come at the cost of empathy, communication, and intimacy. The Stoics recognized that a life devoid of reflection and connection is impoverished, regardless of outward accomplishments. Activity without intentionality may maintain appearances, but erodes the foundations of fulfillment and human flourishing. Moreover, busyness can create the illusion of progress while masking stagnation. One may accumulate tasks, achievements, or possessions, and feel satisfied, yet miss the larger trajectory of life. Are actions aligned with personal values? Are choices leading toward virtue, wisdom, or meaningful contribution? When busyness replaces intentional planning and reflection, people risk building lives of motion without purpose, wealth without contentment, or accomplishments without fulfillment. The Stoics recommend a different approach. Deliberate, purposeful action, punctuated by reflection, work, study, and obligations, should be aligned with reason, virtue, and long-term priorities. Pauses for contemplation are essential. They allow assessment of whether activity advances meaningful goals or simply fills time. Busyness, when unchecked, is a symptom of avoidance, distraction, and fear of confronting life's deeper questions. Even leisure can be misused in the same way. Entertainment, indulgence, or constant social engagement may temporarily relieve discomfort, but they often substitute for thoughtful engagement with oneself. The mind becomes habituated to stimulation, avoiding introspection, self-discipline, and awareness. Stoic practice encourages using both action and rest intentionally, with each serving the cultivation of virtue, wisdom, and inner clarity, rather than merely filling space. Finally, consider the paradox. The busier you appear, the less likely you are to evaluate whether your actions matter. The Stoics emphasized that a life of reflection, purpose, and selective action is more meaningful than one of endless activity. Awareness of priorities, conscious choice of tasks, and disciplined engagement allow energy to be directed toward genuine progress. Busyness without direction is like rowing endlessly on a river without steering. Effort is expended, but the journey lacks destination. Recognizing this pattern is the first step toward liberation. Reflect on how your time is spent. Identify activities that are reactive or habitual rather than intentional, and deliberately reclaim attention for contemplation, purpose, and alignment with values. When busyness is replaced with meaningful action, life becomes rich with purpose, presence, and satisfaction. The Stoic path teaches that true fulfillment emerges not from constant motion, but from deliberate, virtuous, and well-directed effort. Every human mind carries a constant companion, an inner voice that comments, critiques, doubts, and predicts, often subtle, sometimes harsh. This internal dialogue shapes perception, emotion, and behavior. The Stoics observed that unhappiness is frequently nurtured, not by external events, but by this persistent mental chatter. When left unchecked, the inner voice quietly undermines confidence, distorts reality, and fuels suffering, even when circumstances are favorable. The inner voice often takes the form of self-criticism. It magnifies mistakes, replays failures, and questions worth. A single misstep becomes proof of incompetence. A minor social faux pas feels catastrophic. These exaggerated judgments, repeated internally, condition the mind to anticipate disappointment, avoid action, and undervalue achievement. Stoicism teaches that the mind must recognize impressions as just that, impressions, not absolute truth. Thoughts are not inherently factual, they are interpretations, often biased and emotional. This voice also generates fear. What if you fail? What if they judge you? What if it goes wrong? Each thought seems practical on the surface, but in reality, it is often a barrier to action. By constantly anticipating negative outcomes, the inner dialogue keeps the mind tethered to anxiety and indecision. The Stoics emphasized that fear of outcomes outside your control is a primary source of human suffering. Mastery lies in distinguishing between what can be influenced and what cannot, and refusing to be dictated by imagined dangers. Comparison is another weapon of the inner voice. It measures you against peers, societal standards, or arbitrary ideals. Even achievements are undermined by the thought, "It's not enough," or "Others have done better." Gratitude, satisfaction, and joy are eroded when the mind allows constant evaluation against shifting external metrics. The Stoics encouraged focusing on effort, integrity, and virtue as measures of progress, not the fluctuating success of others. Ask yourself directly, how often does your inner voice exaggerate failure, question your worth, or create doubt? How often does it silence you from action, expression, or connection? Observing these patterns is crucial. Stoicism trains the mind to treat thoughts as data, not commands. When you notice self-critical or fearful thoughts, you can acknowledge them, analyze their relevance, and decide whether to act on them. This awareness is the first step toward reclaiming mental autonomy. Even daily routines reveal the inner voice's subtle influence. It convinces you to procrastinate, avoid risk, or cling to comfort. It justifies avoidance. Better not speak up, wait until conditions are perfect, or it's too hard. Each concession may feel safe in the moment, but cumulatively, they erode confidence, growth, and fulfillment. Stoic practice teaches that deliberate reasoned action, rather than capitulation to thought patterns, restores agency. Relationships are not immune. The inner voice projects insecurity onto others. Interpreting neutral actions as judgment or rejection, it can create unnecessary conflict, anxiety, or withdrawal. By attributing meaning that may not exist, the mind generates suffering independently of reality. The Stoics advised examining impressions carefully. Is this thought true? Is it actionable? Is it relevant? By interrogating internal narratives, we reduce the power of self-inflicted distress. Critically, the inner voice can also mislead through perfectionism. It sets impossible standards, insisting on flawless execution or complete control. The result is chronic dissatisfaction, as reality inevitably falls short of imagined ideals. Stoicism emphasizes accepting imperfection while striving for excellence within the bounds of reason and virtue. Peace arises from recognizing effort and intention as the true measures of success, not imagined perfection. Engaging with this voice requires practice. Daily reflection, mindfulness, journaling, and self-inquiry are tools to disentangle constructive thought from destructive patterns. Challenge the authority of thoughts that instill fear, self-doubt, or resentment. Reinforce internal guidance rooted in reason, virtue, and observation, rather than reactive emotion. This is how the mind regains sovereignty over itself. The paradox of the inner voice is that it can be transformed into an ally. When trained and observed, it provides insight, foresight, and moral reflection. Constructive self-dialogue encourages learning, self-awareness, and ethical growth. Stoicism reframes internal critique from a source of suffering into a tool for disciplined reflection. The mind that once undermined becomes a guide toward wisdom. Ultimately, the inner voice only undermines when left unchecked and unquestioned. Peace, confidence, and resilience arise from observing thoughts, discerning truth, and acting in accordance with reason and virtue. By mastering the internal dialogue, the mind reclaims autonomy, freeing itself from the silent saboteur that perpetuates unhappiness. Many people treat peace as though it is a prize to be won, a state to arrive at after achieving goals, acquiring possessions, or mastering circumstances. The Stoics, however, taught that peace is not a destination. It is a disciplined practice, cultivated moment by moment, through deliberate control of perception, judgment, and action. Happiness and tranquility do not arrive magically. They are forged through consistent, conscious effort in alignment with reason and virtue. Consider how easily peace is misunderstood. We imagine that financial security, recognition, or the absence of conflict will bring serenity. Yet, external conditions are unstable, unpredictable, and often beyond our control. When we tie peace to circumstance, it becomes fragile. A setback, insult, or loss can dissolve it instantly. The Stoics emphasized that inner tranquility arises from mastery of the mind, not from favorable events. Peace is maintained when impressions are judged correctly, desires are disciplined, and effort is applied to what is within one's control. The discipline of peace requires awareness. Every day the mind encounters stimuli designed to provoke reaction, criticism, injustice, temptation, disappointment. Left unmanaged, these external events trigger emotional turbulence. The Stoic practice of mindfulness, attentive observation of thoughts and impressions, allows the individual to respond rationally rather than react impulsively. Peace is the result of repeated choice, not of fortune aligning with expectation. A key element of this discipline is self-mastery. Emotions, while natural, can be misdirected when reason is absent. Anger, jealousy, or fear often arise not from external events themselves, but from judgments we impose on them. By training perception to interpret events accurately and rationally, the mind reduces unnecessary agitation. Peace emerges not from the elimination of challenges, but from the cultivation of a resilient attitude toward them. Ask yourself, how often do you wait for external circumstances to feel calm? How often do you let irritation, fear, or disappointment control your emotional state? Stoicism teaches that waiting for perfect conditions is futile. Instead, peace is achieved through daily practice, observing impressions, moderating responses, and aligning action with virtue. Each disciplined choice strengthens resilience and reduces dependence on external factors for contentment. Even relationships require this approach. Conflicts, misunderstandings, or disagreements are inevitable. The disciplined mind does not seek to control others or avoid discomfort, but chooses measured, reasoned responses. By focusing on what is within control, speech, behavior, and judgment, peace becomes a habit rather than a contingent reward. The Stoics reminded us that tranquility is a property of the rational mind, not a gift of circumstance. Daily routines and habits reinforce this discipline. Small acts, pausing before reacting, reframing challenges, practicing gratitude, and evaluating judgments, train the mind to maintain calm under pressure. Over time, these practices accumulate into a stable disposition. Peace becomes a skill, like muscle built through repetition, rather than a fragile state that appears sporadically. The discipline of peace also requires acceptance of impermanence. External events will always fluctuate, and human behavior cannot be fully controlled. By internalizing this truth, the mind avoids futile struggle and preserves energy for deliberate action. Resistance to reality breeds suffering. Disciplined acceptance fosters serenity. The more consistently the mind aligns with this principle, the more naturally peace manifests, even amid adversity. Even setbacks and failures serve as opportunities to practice. When plans fail, relationships falter, or expectations collapse, the disciplined mind observes without panic, evaluates without bias, and responds with reasoned action. Peace is not achieved by avoiding difficulties, but by cultivating the capacity to remain composed through them. In this sense, the Stoics framed tranquility as an active achievement, maintained by consistent application of reason. Ultimately, understanding peace as a discipline transforms the approach to life. It shifts focus from chasing outcomes, external validation, or comfort, to cultivating intentional thought, virtuous action, and measured response. Tranquility is no longer a distant reward. It is exercised moment by moment, built into the rhythm of daily existence. By committing to this practice, the mind becomes resilient, emotions balanced, and life lived with clarity, freedom, and enduring serenity. Human beings naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. This is not inherently wrong. It is a basic instinct. However, the Stoics warned that unbridled pursuit of pleasure, or the belief that happiness lies in indulgence, is one of the most subtle and destructive sources of unhappiness. Chasing pleasure as a primary goal creates a cycle of dependency, dissatisfaction, and emptiness, because external enjoyment is fleeting, unpredictable, and never fully sufficient to satisfy the deeper needs of the mind and soul. Consider how this manifests. We consume, indulge, and seek stimulation in food, entertainment, comfort, social recognition, or material acquisition. Each experience produces temporary satisfaction, a fleeting rush of delight, but the effect is transient. Soon the mind craves the next experience, the next thrill, or the next reward. Stoicism teaches that basing contentment on these transient pleasures is like building a house on sand. It may appear stable momentarily, but it collapses at the slightest shift. The pleasure trap is not only about excess, it can be subtle. Even activities commonly seen as productive or virtuous can be distorted by the pursuit of pleasure, helping others for recognition, exercising for admiration, studying for status. When the motivation is external reward rather than internal principle, fulfillment is never fully realized. Happiness becomes conditional, fragile, and dependent on factors beyond control. Ask yourself, which pleasures do you pursue compulsively, expecting them to bring lasting satisfaction? How often do you find yourself empty after moments of indulgence, craving more to fill a void that never disappears? Recognizing these patterns is the first step toward liberation. The Stoics advise shifting focus from transient pleasure to enduring virtue, reasoned action, and self-mastery. These, unlike fleeting gratification, are within your control and capable of producing genuine contentment. The pursuit of pleasure also fuels comparison. Social media, advertising, and cultural narratives constantly signal what should bring enjoyment, luxury, success, attractiveness, or leisure. The mind, conditioned by these signals, measures its satisfaction against external benchmarks, never truly content with what it has. This comparison compounds dissatisfaction, making pleasure a treadmill. The more you chase, the less fulfilled you feel. Even bodily indulgence can backfire. Food, comfort, and sensory gratification may provide momentary delight, yet the mind grows restless, craving intensity or novelty. Emotional habituation dulls the effect over time, requiring ever-increasing stimulation to achieve the same sensation. Stoicism teaches moderation, and the recognition that pleasure is not an ultimate goal, but a transient impression that should be enjoyed without attachment or dependence. Relationships are not immune. Seeking affection, attention, or validation as a primary source of pleasure can create vulnerability and dissatisfaction. Dependence on others' responsiveness for emotional reward exposes the mind to constant fluctuation. Stoics recommend orienting oneself toward virtue and reasoned action in interactions, finding stability within rather than in the unpredictable behavior of others. The trap also affects professional life. Ambition fueled by prestige, rewards, or acclaim may provide intermittent satisfaction, but rarely delivers lasting peace. Each achievement temporarily elevates mood, but the mind quickly recalibrates, seeking the next accolade. Stoic practice emphasizes effort, skill, and integrity for their own sake, not for external pleasure or recognition. This mindset generates durable satisfaction and reduces vulnerability to the highs and lows of fortune. The antidote is deliberate, mindful engagement with desire. Recognize the impermanence of pleasure, detach from dependence on it, and cultivate fulfillment through action consistent with reason and virtue. Pleasure, when experienced without attachment or expectation, becomes a gentle companion rather than a tyrant. Happiness is thus relocated from chasing fleeting sensation to developing the mind's strength, clarity, and resilience. Finally, the Stoics remind us that the mind trained in discipline can experience deeper, more sustainable forms of joy, serenity, purpose, and freedom, unattainable through external indulgence alone. The pleasure trap ensnares, because it promises fulfillment, but delivers only a temporary echo. By redirecting attention inward, cultivating virtue, and exercising self-mastery, the emptiness that follows indulgence dissolves, replaced by enduring contentment and the quiet satisfaction of a disciplined, rational life. Loss is an inevitable part of life. People, possessions, opportunities, and moments, all are transient. Yet human nature often resists this truth, clinging tightly to what has passed or what can no longer be controlled. The Stoics emphasized that suffering intensifies when the mind refuses to let go. Attachment to what is impermanent converts natural grief into prolonged anguish, and resistance to change deepens the pain unnecessarily. Consider how this manifests in daily life. Relationships end, jobs are lost, dreams falter, or even simple routines change. The mind instinctively reaches backward, seeking to restore what is gone, replaying memories, and imagining alternative outcomes. Every thought that insists, "It should not have happened this way," or "I must have it back," amplifies emotional turmoil. The Stoics recognize that much of human suffering stems not from loss itself, but from this mental resistance to reality. Attachment creates an illusion of control. By clinging to what is gone, the mind tries to rewrite the world according to desire rather than fact. This struggle generates frustration, resentment, and bitterness. It also traps attention in the past, preventing engagement with what is possible in the present. Life, the Stoics teach, is best navigated when the mind discerns between what is within one's power and what is not. Release is not passivity, it is recognition of what cannot be changed, freeing energy for deliberate action in the here and now. Ask yourself, what have you been holding on to too tightly? Which losses do you replay endlessly, feeling as though letting go would betray their significance? Awareness is the first step. The Stoics encouraged reflection on the impermanence of all things. Understanding that people, possessions, and circumstances are transient allows detachment, not in coldness but in clarity and resilience. Emotional suffering lessens when the mind ceases to resist reality. Clinging to loss also distorts perspective. We magnify absence, exaggerate regret, and imagine worse alternatives, while forgetting the richness of what remains. Stoic practice involves observing events without embellishment, accepting impermanence as natural, and finding gratitude for what still exists. By releasing attachment to what is gone, the mind creates space for appreciation, growth, and engagement with the present. Even in relationships, the pain of loss is compounded by refusal to let go. Holding on to anger, resentment, or longing can prolong suffering long after the circumstances have changed. Stoicism encourages the cultivation of inner resilience, and the recognition that control over others' actions and choices is limited. Emotional autonomy comes from focusing on one's own judgments, reactions, and virtues, rather than the unpredictable actions of others. The paradox is clear: resistance to loss intensifies grief, whereas acceptance mitigates it. Letting go does not mean forgetting or denying significance. It means acknowledging reality without unnecessary mental struggle. Peace arises from disciplined detachment, reflection, and understanding the natural cycle of change. By consciously releasing attachment to what cannot be restored, the mind preserves its energy, stability, and capacity for constructive action. Even material loss demonstrates this principle. Objects, wealth, or status can be lost through fortune, theft, or neglect. Those who cling to them experience distress beyond the actual practical consequences. Stoicism teaches that value resides not in possession, but in use, appreciation, and ethical engagement. By accepting impermanence, the mind avoids unnecessary suffering and cultivates equanimity, regardless of external change. Finally, loss is an opportunity for growth. The Stoics observed that confronting impermanence fosters resilience, wisdom, and emotional maturity. Letting go strengthens judgment, reduces dependence on circumstance for happiness, and clarifies what is truly meaningful. The mind learns to focus on virtue, reason, and action within its control, rather than being trapped by nostalgia, regret, or longing. Loss hurts less when the mind practices release, acceptance, and disciplined reflection. The pain of attachment is not unavoidable. It is amplified by resistance. By letting go, one transforms grief into insight, sorrow into understanding, and absence into the space for purposeful living. Stoicism teaches that freedom from unnecessary suffering comes not from avoiding loss, but from refusing to give power to what is beyond control, cultivating a resilient, serene, and disciplined mind. One of the most insidious sources of unhappiness is the habit of measuring oneself by standards that are not truly one's own. Society, culture, peers, family, and even social media impose ideals, expectations, and benchmarks that can feel compulsory. The Stoics warned that adopting these external standards as the measure of self-worth leads to chronic dissatisfaction, anxiety, and a restless mind. Happiness becomes perpetually deferred because it is contingent upon approval, comparison, and the shifting demands of others rather than on personal virtue and reason. From a young age, people are conditioned to fit in and pursue external markers of success: grades, jobs, wealth, appearance, popularity, or recognition. Each of these carries implicit judgments about adequacy. As adults, the pattern persists. Careers are chosen for prestige rather than purpose. Possessions are accumulated for status, and social behavior is governed by imagined expectations. When life is measured against these external benchmarks, no amount of achievement ever seems sufficient, because the standard itself is arbitrary, often contradictory, and constantly changing. Ask yourself, how often have you pursued goals or values because others expected it, or because everyone else is doing it? How often have you compared yourself to peers, social media personas, or cultural ideals, finding yourself lacking despite real effort and accomplishment? Awareness of this tendency is the first step toward liberation. The Stoics teach that the only meaningful standard is virtue, reason, and ethical alignment. By evaluating oneself according to internal principles rather than external impositions, the mind gains autonomy and peace. Comparison is particularly destructive because it is endless. There will always be someone wealthier, more talented, or more admired. Social media amplifies this, offering curated glimpses of achievement and success that often bear little resemblance to reality. Measuring against these illusions ensures perpetual dissatisfaction. The Stoics advised focusing not on outcomes or appearances, but on effort, judgment, and moral integrity, the aspects truly under one's control. Happiness, when grounded in external approval, becomes a fragile, fleeting commodity. Even subtle, well-meaning feedback from others can distort self-perception. Praise, criticism, and advice often carry implicit standards that may not align with one's personal values. Stoicism emphasizes the importance of discernment. Evaluate external input critically, accept what is useful, and discard what imposes irrelevant expectations. Doing so preserves mental autonomy and prevents the inner mind from being hijacked by outside influence. This habit of adopting external standards also undermines authentic growth. When effort is directed toward meeting arbitrary benchmarks, attention and energy are diverted from meaningful development. Self-exploration, skill cultivation, ethical reflection, and deliberate choice are replaced with mimicry and performance. The mind becomes reactive, seeking validation rather than pursuing genuine improvement. Stoic practice centers on mastery of the self, developing virtues, reasoned judgment, and intentional action, rather than meeting fluctuating external criteria. Even relationships are affected. Seeking approval or validation from others often guides choices, words, and behaviors. The mind becomes conditioned to anticipate judgment, adjusting conduct to fit perceived expectations. Freedom is lost. Satisfaction depends on factors outside one's control. Acceptance of oneself, guided by internal principles rather than external approval, is essential to reclaiming emotional and ethical autonomy. The paradox is clear. By striving to meet others' standards, you diminish your own. Peace, contentment, and authenticity are sacrificed to chase a moving target that was never yours to begin with. Stoic wisdom asserts that the measure of a life is not conformity, prestige, or external reward. It is the cultivation of virtue, rationality, and deliberate choice. Internal benchmarks, grounded in reason, provide stability and resilience, even when the world's standards fluctuate. Even in moments of achievement, measuring by others' standards often leaves the mind restless. Recognition, success, and wealth may bring temporary satisfaction, but if the standard is external, contentment is conditional and unstable. True fulfillment arises from evaluating actions against personal values and ethical principles, ensuring that effort and intention, not outcome or comparison, are the true measures of success. Ultimately, measuring yourself by standards that aren't yours guarantees dissatisfaction. Freedom from this trap emerges when the mind chooses its own yardstick, reason, virtue, and alignment with personal principles. By doing so, the mind liberates itself from the endless cycle of comparison, external validation, and artificial pressure, allowing genuine contentment, confidence, and peace to flourish independently of circumstance. Humans have a remarkable ability to prolong their own suffering, often unintentionally. We replay past mistakes, ruminate over perceived injustices, and anticipate negative outcomes, turning ordinary experiences into prolonged agony. The Stoics warned that suffering itself can become habitual, a default state of the mind, when not tempered by wisdom. In fact, much of what we experience as misery is not imposed by external events, but cultivated internally through thought patterns, expectations, and resistance to reality. Consider the mechanisms of self-inflicted suffering. The mind exaggerates small discomforts, imagines worst-case scenarios, or dwells on regrets. Each repetition strengthens the neural pathways of anxiety, resentment, or despair, making suffering feel familiar and unavoidable. By contrast, wisdom, the ability to judge accurately, to act in accordance with reason, and to distinguish between what is within one's control and what is not, provides liberation. Without cultivating wisdom, humans often practice suffering like a skill, perfecting the art of self-torment, while believing it is unavoidable. Ask yourself, how often do you replay events that cannot be changed, criticize yourself excessively, or dwell on imagined failures? How often does worry about the future drain your energy, making present moments unbearable? These patterns reflect habitual suffering, which the Stoics viewed as an unnecessary, avoidable burden. Wisdom, cultivated through reflection, reason, and disciplined action, interrupts this cycle, offering perspective and mental freedom. Suffering is often reinforced by attachment. We cling to outcomes, possessions, relationships, or expectations, believing that losing them equates to ruin. Each instance of attachment magnifies the potential for disappointment, anxiety, or grief. Stoic practice emphasizes that control resides within the mind, in choices, perceptions, and judgments, not in external events. The cultivation of wisdom allows one to navigate change, loss, and uncertainty without falling into habitual suffering. Even social influence plays a role. Comparing ourselves to others, seeking validation, or fearing judgment generates constant mental discomfort. The mind rehearses scenarios of failure or rejection, creating suffering independent of actual circumstances. Practicing wisdom means recognizing these influences, understanding their impact, and refusing to surrender inner peace to external pressures. By consciously guiding perception, the mind becomes resilient, aware, and less susceptible to manufactured misery. The Stoics also noted that deliberate reflection on mortality, impermanence, and the limitations of human experience reduces unnecessary suffering. When we acknowledge that pain, loss, and adversity are natural, inevitable parts of life, we cease resisting reality and inflating the impact of hardship. Practicing suffering arises from ignorance of these truths. Wisdom transforms perspective, making challenges opportunities for growth, courage, and virtue rather than prolonged torment. Even emotional responses must be disciplined. Anger, jealousy, or envy often thrive on habitual suffering, feeding the mind with imagined wrongs or perceived slights. The Stoics taught that emotions are neither inherently good nor bad. They become constructive or destructive depending on judgment. By applying reason and discernment, the mind can feel appropriate emotion without allowing it to dominate, avoiding unnecessary prolongation of mental pain. The paradox is clear. Suffering can be practiced, often unconsciously, while wisdom must be deliberately cultivated. Habits of worry, attachment, resentment, and rumination reinforce misery. Reflection, reason, and virtue cultivate freedom. The Stoic path teaches that the mind is like a garden. Neglect allows weeds of suffering to flourish, while deliberate cultivation produces clarity, resilience, and contentment. Ultimately, choosing wisdom over habitual suffering is a decision repeated moment by moment. By observing thoughts, evaluating judgments, and aligning action with reason and virtue, one interrupts self-inflicted misery. The mind trained in wisdom recognizes suffering, experiences it with clarity, and acts purposefully, rather than reacting unconsciously. True freedom emerges when one ceases to practice suffering as habit and embraces the disciplined pursuit of understanding, virtue, and equanimity. One of the cruelest forms of self-imposed unhappiness is the gap between knowledge and action. Many people understand what is necessary for a good, balanced, and meaningful life, yet fail to live accordingly. They know the value of self-discipline, honesty, mindfulness, and moderation, but continue habits that undermine well-being. The Stoics warned that wisdom alone is insufficient if it is not translated into daily practice. Knowing the truth without living it is like carrying a map yet refusing to follow its directions. Insight exists, but life remains chaotic, unsatisfied, and fragile. Consider how this gap manifests. People may intellectually grasp the impermanence of possessions, relationships, or status, yet cling desperately to them. They understand that anger, jealousy, and resentment harm the mind, yet indulge in these emotions habitually. They know the importance of measured action, reflection, and virtue, yet procrastinate, overindulge, or pursue trivial distractions. Awareness without application becomes a source of frustration. Knowing what must be done but failing to act produces guilt, regret, and tension. Ask yourself, how often do you intellectually agree with principles or truths, but fail to implement them? Where does your life contradict your own understanding of what is virtuous, necessary, or meaningful? Stoicism teaches that true knowledge is inseparable from action. Wisdom is not simply insight or theory, it is embodied practice. The mind that knows yet does not act is vulnerable to unhappiness precisely because it perceives a standard it fails to meet. Even well-meaning habits can reinforce this divide. Reading, learning, or reflecting without application can feel productive, but may actually exacerbate dissatisfaction. The mind becomes aware of its shortcomings, comparing what it knows should be done with what it continues to fail to do. Awareness without practice amplifies tension, creating a cycle of knowledge-induced frustration. The Stoics emphasized that philosophy is not an intellectual exercise alone, it is a way of life. External pressures further complicate this divide. Social norms, expectations, and temptations often challenge the implementation of truth. Even when the mind recognizes the proper course, external distractions and internal inertia make alignment difficult. Stoicism advises focusing on what is controllable, personal judgment, action, and effort. By acting in accordance with truth in small, deliberate steps, the gap between knowledge and life narrows, and suffering diminishes. The paradox is stark. Knowing the truth, yet failing to live it, often causes more anguish than ignorance. Ignorance may shield the mind from recognizing its own inconsistency, while conscious awareness of failure breeds self-recrimination and unease. The Stoics teach that ethical and practical alignment, the harmonization of knowledge, perception, and action is essential to mental tranquility and resilience. Relationships, habits, and ambitions all suffer from this disconnect. Promises unfulfilled, principles ignored, and commitments neglected erode trust in oneself, reinforcing dissatisfaction. By embodying understanding, speaking and acting in alignment with personal insight, one restores integrity, reduces internal conflict, and cultivates authentic confidence. Daily practice bridges the gap. Reflection, journaling, mindful decision-making, and deliberate alignment of action with values gradually integrate knowledge into life. Even incremental adherence transforms the mind, reinforcing the habit of living truth rather than merely contemplating it. Stoicism teaches that each choice, however small, is an opportunity to embody wisdom, aligning thought and deed. Ultimately, knowing the truth, but refusing to live it, perpetuates inner conflict and unhappiness. Freedom, tranquility, and fulfillment emerge only when insight becomes action. Principles are enacted, and the mind's understanding informs every decision. Life lived in alignment with truth is not a sudden achievement, but a disciplined practice, a stoic journey of integrity, reflection, and intentional action. Throughout life, unhappiness often feels like an external force, a consequence of circumstances, other people, or luck. Yet the Stoics teach a profound and unsettling truth. Unhappiness is rarely accidental. It arises from patterns of thought, attachment, and misjudgment. Desire becomes suffering, attachment turns into grief, and dependency on external validation erodes inner stability. The mind, when untrained, magnifies trivial discomforts, resists change, and clings to illusions of control. In essence, the root of discontent lies not in life itself, but in the way we engage with it. Each section of this exploration has highlighted a distinct source of unhappiness: the illusion of control, the trap of desire, the perils of comparison, the subtle tyranny of the inner voice, and the habit of practicing suffering rather than wisdom. Stoicism consistently points to the same principle. Freedom from unnecessary misery emerges from disciplined cultivation of the mind. True contentment is not the absence of difficulty, nor the fulfillment of every desire. It is mastery over one's perceptions, judgments, and responses. By understanding that only some things are within your control, You stop granting power to fortune, circumstance, or the whims of others. The Stoics emphasize that wisdom and action are inseparable. Knowing the truth is insufficient if it is not applied in daily life. Intellectual understanding of impermanence, virtue, and self-mastery must translate into behavior, choices, and habits. Otherwise, knowledge becomes a source of frustration, a constant reminder of the gap between what is and what ought to be. Happiness emerges when perception, judgment, and action are aligned, when the mind no longer rebels against reality, but engages with it thoughtfully and deliberately. Letting go of attachment is central. Loss, failure, and change are inevitable. Clinging to the past or resisting impermanence intensifies pain. Stoicism teaches acceptance, not as surrender, but as clarity and strength. By releasing dependence on external outcomes, the mind gains resilience, peace, and freedom. Similarly, external validation, social comparison, and adoption of standards that aren't one's own create a persistent void. Happiness is not a reflection of external approval. It is cultivated through self-alignment with reason and virtue. Discipline is the key. Peace is not a destination to be found once goals are achieved. It is a practice, exercised moment by moment through reflection, choice, and ethical engagement. Desire, pleasure, and fear must be observed and moderated, not eliminated. The mind, trained in observation, detachment, and intentional action, learns to face adversity, loss, and challenge with equanimity. Even inevitable suffering becomes an opportunity for growth, insight, and ethical refinement. Ultimately, unhappiness persists when we surrender our inner authority to habit, opinion, desire, or circumstance. Freedom, tranquility, and fulfillment are cultivated, not stumbled upon. By practicing self-mastery, embracing impermanence, aligning knowledge with action, and exercising reasoned judgment, the mind reclaims sovereignty. Happiness is not a gift of fortune. It is a product of disciplined effort, cultivated perception, and the conscious choice to live in harmony with truth, virtue, and reality. The journey toward contentment is not instantaneous. It demands vigilance, reflection, and repeated practice. But the reward is profound. A mind no longer at the mercy of external forces, a heart free from unnecessary suffering, and a life lived deliberately rather than reactively. Unhappiness is not an accident. It is a choice, often unconscious, but so too is peace. And through Stoic practice, that peace becomes attainable, enduring, and real.